G'day, and thank you for joining me today on Essays from a Strange Country. I'm your host, writer, and producer, Jasmine Wolfe. Each episode explores Australia through the stories we tell and the culture we create. Through literature, film, art, and music, I'll examine the people, ideas, myths, and contradictions that shape Australia and our understanding of ourselves. So settle in and let's begin. Michel de Kretzer's The Lost Dog is not merely a novel about disappearance, migration, and private unease. It is a cultural document that exposes a more persistent Australian condition. The difficulty of feeling at home in a place built upon acts of historical forgetting. The novel's central anxieties, Tom Loxley's lost dog, his shame before his Indian mother, Nelly Zhang's art of destroyed originals, the spectral pressure of the bush, gather around a national problem that is both intimate and historical. Australia appears here not as a settled identity, but as an unsettled arrangement, modern, ironic, efficient, and outward-facing, yet continually disturbed by what it has attempted to discard. This disturbance is uncanny because it returns from within. The histories treated as obsolete or inconvenient, colonial violence, terra nullius, racial exclusion, migrant shame, bodily decline, do not remain outside the national home. They knock at the door. De Kretzer's Australia is therefore less a sanctuary than a carefully sanitized interior whose exclusions have become structurally unstable. The nation's desire to be modern depends upon the repression of whatever appears archaic, foreign, abject, or wasteful. Yet these rejected forms supply the novel with its most insistent images and moral pressure. The Lost Dog reveals contemporary Australian identity as a recursive struggle between a flight into modernity and the ghostly return of what modernity disavows. Irony, aesthetic distance, and cosmopolitan polish function as strategies of mastery, allowing characters to manage provincial embarrassment and historical discomfort. But the novel steadily undermines this mastery by showing that the past is not past, the body cannot be purified away, and the landscape is not an empty stage for national reinvention. Through its Gothic motifs, fractured temporal structure, and recurring aesthetics of absence, The Lost Dog suggests that Australian belonging is founded not on secure possession, but on anxiety. A home made unfamiliar by everything it has labelled foreign matter. The landscape of The Lost Dog is never merely scenery. It is a disturbed surface, one that has been made to appear empty only through strenuous cultural labour. De Kretzer's Australia is inhabited as a spatial and cultural vacuum, yet the novel steadily undoes that fantasy by presenting place as a geographical palimpsest, written over, not unwritten, haunted, not vacant. The bush in particular refuses its conventional role as a proving ground for settler confidence. It is instead a zone of apprehension walked by strangers and ghosts, where possession is never quite assured and belonging never settles into fact. This is a pointed reversal of a durable Australian myth. The colonial imagination depended upon the fiction of terra nullius, not simply as a legal convenience, but as a moral anaesthetic. To call the continent empty was to make occupation appear less like dispossession and more like arrival. De Kretzer's bush unsettles this inherited script. It is not the clean, open space of nationalist romance, nor the picturesque wilderness available for aesthetic consumption. It is constructed from narratives of disaster, a phrase that suggests not natural danger alone, but accumulated human violence, loss, erasure, failed settlement, racial exclusion, and the ordinary brutality of looking away. The land is uncanny because it contains what official memory has tried to remove from it. The novel's Gothic motifs sharpen this historical unease. The image of the bricked-up door at which the past continues to knock gives architectural form to repression. What has been sealed away has not disappeared. It has merely been made inaccessible to polite consciousness. The Gothic here is not decorative gloom imported from Europe and pasted onto Australian soil. It becomes a fitting mode for a settler society whose domestic interiors are built against an outside they cannot master. The more thoroughly the door is bricked up, the more insistently it announces what lies behind it. De Kretzer's Gothic therefore exposes a national habit, the desire to inhabit modernity without acknowledging the foundations on which that modernity stands. The novel's temporal structure extends this logic. Its movement between 2001 Melbourne and mid-20th century India prevents history from remaining neatly chronological or nationally contained. The reader is required to hold multiple pasts together: colonial India, post-colonial migration, suburban Australia, the 2001 refugee crisis, and the older, largely unspoken violence of Aboriginal dispossession. These layers do not merge into a harmonious multicultural tableau. They rub against each other. The result is not continuity in the comforting sense, but recurrence, history returning in altered forms, each moment exposing the unfinished business of the last. The 2001 refugee crisis is crucial in this respect. Positioned as a convulsion of the past, it reveals Australia's anxious relationship to strangers, borders, and legitimacy. The rhetoric of national defence during that period often relied upon the fantasy that Australia was a settled home threatened by alien intrusion. De Kretzer's irony is that Australia itself is a land of strangers, made by arrival, seizure, displacement, and selective forgetting. The fear of the refugee thus becomes a confession coded as denial. The nation disavows in others the condition that structures its own history. Yet there is a danger in reading settler haunting too generously. To cast white or assimilated settler subjects chiefly as haunted may risk converting historical violence into psychological discomfort, allowing perpetrator trauma to occupy the emotional center. Such a maneuver can soften the material facts of dispossession and exploitation, substituting unease for accountability. De Kretzer's achievement lies in keeping that discomfort unstable. Haunting does not absolve, it indicts. The settler subject is in place and out of place at once, not because belonging has been tragically denied, but because it has been built upon a vacancy that was never vacant. In The Lost Dog, modernity is not merely a historical condition but a cultivated manner, a way of speaking, desiring, judging, and disowning. Tom Loxley's allegiance to modern literature is therefore more than professional taste. He has invented himself through the study of modern literature, treating the modern as a discipline of self-cleansing, a means of scraping away the dull sediment of tradition. To be modern, for Tom, is to possess a certain lightness, to move without ancestral drag, without provincial earnestness, without the humiliating residue of origins. It is an attractive fantasy, particularly in a culture anxious about being late, derivative, or stranded at the edge of empire. Modernity offers the Australian subject a compensatory elegance, the poise of someone who has seen through everything before anyone else has had the bad manners to believe in it. Irony becomes the privileged instrument of that poise. De Kretzer's narration often works through aphoristic compression and satirical glancing blows, exposing the absurdities of consumer refinement, foodie culture, academic self-importance, and the casual cruelties of neoliberal life. This irony matters because it is not simply decorative wit. It functions as a trope of mastery, a technique for placing the self at a controlled distance from embarrassment, dependency, grief, and terrible news. To be ironic is to appear unfooled. It allows Tom and the recognisably modern Australian world around him to convert vulnerability into style. The danger, of course, is that irony can become less a form of intelligence than a form of hygiene. It disinfects experience before experience can make a claim. Tom's shame before the archaic reveals the violence hidden inside this cultivated sophistication. His mother Iris embodies what he cannot comfortably assimilate: age, bodily need, colonial memory, and the discarded Indianness he has tried to outgrow. Her presence recalls not only another country but another tempo. She belongs to histories that do not move at the sleek pace of metropolitan reinvention. Tom's embarrassment at seeming out of date is therefore not a trivial social anxiety. It is a cultural reflex. The archaic is treated as contamination, as though the past were a stain rather than a condition of life. Iris becomes, in this logic, not simply his mother, but the inconvenient archive of everything his modern self has suppressed. This flight into modernity has a specifically Australian pressure behind it. A settler culture formed in the afterlife of empire often experiences itself as belated, neither fully metropolitan nor comfortably indigenous to place. The misfortune of being small change after empire produces an impatience with inherited forms and a susceptibility to the endless rage for the new. The result is a national style that mistrusts solemnity, yet remains oddly vulnerable to fashion, that mocks pretension while anxiously measuring itself against elsewhere, that celebrates plainness while craving the prestige of being up to date. In this context, Tom's private shame becomes a social symptom. His self-fashioning dramatizes a broader Australian desire to escape the accusation of provincialism by appearing permanently contemporary. Yet de Kretser does not simply condemn modernity as false consciousness, nor does she sentimentalize tradition as a lost moral home. The novel's most searching complication comes through Nelly Zhang, whose art unsettles the easy opposition between the modern and the archaic. Nelly works with salvage, remnants, copies, and destroyed originals. Her practice suggests an alternative modernity, in which the new is not purchased by obliterating the old. Against the sterile glamour of clean surfaces and current taste, her work understands that nothing dates quicker than now. Modernity in this formulation is not escape from ghosts, but an altered relation to them. Nelly's art exposes the poverty of Tom's defensive irony. Where his modernity depends on distance, hers depends on contact, with fragments, losses, failed continuities, and damaged inheritances. She does not offer reconciliation in any neat therapeutic sense. Rather, she makes visible the forms of dependence that irony would prefer to deny. The truly modern gesture the novel implies may not be the jettisoning of the archaic, but the capacity to find room for ghosts without surrendering to nostalgia. Tom's shame lies in believing that freedom requires disposal. De Kretser's sharper irony is to show that such disposal is itself an old story and not a very modern one. The nation here appears not as a secure community, but as an anxious sorting mechanism. Its borders are not only geographical, they are moral, social, and symbolic. To belong is to remain intelligible as useful, respectable, and governable. To fall outside those categories is to risk being treated not simply as marginal, but as refuse. The label of waste is therefore not incidental. It is the language through which exclusion becomes ordinary, even practical. Once a person or group is named as waste, removal can be made to look less like violence than hygiene. This is the logic of abjection. The abject is not wholly foreign, it is disturbingly close. It is what the social body rejects in order to imagine itself clean, coherent, and properly bounded. That is why the fear of expulsion is so potent. The rejected figure threatens the nation not because they are entirely outside it, but because they expose what the nation must deny about itself: poverty, dependency, racialized hierarchy, failed care, and the fragility of belonging. The waste figure becomes a convenient container for these anxieties. Their degradation reassures others that the system still knows how to distinguish the worthy from the disposable. Such a distinction is rarely neutral. In the Australian context, the fantasy of a tidy national body has long depended on acts of removal. The dispossession of Aboriginal peoples, the policing of non-white migration, the confinement of asylum seekers, and the bureaucratic management of those deemed socially unproductive. These histories differ and should not be collapsed into one another, but they share a recurring habit of national self-defense. The state presents exclusion as necessity, while the excluded are made to carry the stigma of disorder. The nation washes its hands, often with considerable ceremony. The fear of being cast out also disciplines those who remain inside. If waste is the fate of the non-compliant, then belonging becomes conditional. Individuals learn to perform usefulness, gratitude, and restraint. They learn that citizenship or social acceptance may be less a right than a probationary status. This produces a bleak intimacy between inclusion and terror. One belongs by proving that one is not like those who have been discarded. The border in this sense runs through everyday life. It divides not only citizen from stranger, but respectable from shameful, productive from burdensome, visible from inconvenient. The label of waste also strips history from the people it names. It makes social outcomes appear natural. Those abandoned by policy, economy, or empire are represented as if they have merely failed in private. This is one of the more efficient cruelties of the term. It turns produced disposability into personal defect. The abject subject is then blamed for the very conditions that made them abject. Yet abjection is unstable. What is expelled continues to return, troubling the national story that required its removal. The discarded body, the detained stranger, the impoverished citizen, the racialized outsider, each reveals the violence hidden beneath the rhetoric of cohesion. The nation's fear is therefore not only fear of contamination, it is fear of recognition. To see the so-called waste clearly is to see the system that needed waste in the first place. Nelly Zhang's art offers the novel's most concentrated account of absence as an Australian aesthetic principle. Her practice is deliberately perverse. She paints, destroys the paintings, and exhibits photographic copies of the vanished originals. What remains is not the artwork in any conventional sense, but its after-image, a record of something already lost. This is a style fashioned from lack, and its force lies in refusing the consolations of origin, authenticity, and possession. The work does not allow the viewer to stand before the original and claim proximity to truth. It offers instead a mediated remnant, a likeness whose authority depends upon acknowledged disappearance. This secondary mimesis matters because it gives form to a culture built upon interruption. Nelly's photographs are copies but not mere substitutes. They become tribute to and memory of what is no longer there, making absence present without pretending to restore what has been destroyed. Photography, as a spectral medium, is crucial here. It has always carried a faintly morbid charge. The photographed thing exists in the image as proof that it once stood before the lens, even if it has since vanished. In Nelly's work, that logic is intensified. The original does not simply recede into time, it has been deliberately obliterated. The photograph therefore becomes both evidence and elegy, a memorial that quietly indicts the act of erasure on which it depends. Tom's attraction to Nelly's art is not incidental. As a scholar of the uncanny, he is disposed to recognize the disturbance produced when something absent returns in altered form. Yet his fascination is also personal. Nelly's destroyed originals mirror his own fractured relation to ancestry, migration, and belonging. He experiences no continuity with his ancestors in Australia. His family history cannot be folded neatly into the settler story of inheritance, nor into a migrant tale of triumphant arrival. Like Nelly's photographs, Tom's identity is mediated through loss, displacement, and partial recovery. What he encounters in her work is not simply an aesthetic puzzle, but a structure of feeling, the knowledge that one's present may be composed of missing originals. The novel's formal intelligence lies in extending this aesthetic into its treatment of history. The past does not appear as a stable archive waiting to be consulted. It infects the nowscape as atmosphere, trace, repetition, and unease. This is the spooky, real, not fantasy, but reality apprehended through its suppressed residues. The uncanny is not an imported Gothic ornament laid over Australian life for literary effect. It names a condition in which the ordinary world, suburbs, galleries, kitchens, bush roads, feels insufficiently sealed against what has been excluded from it. The clean surfaces of modern life do not abolish history. They merely provide better screens on which its shadows can appear. Nelly's art also challenges the market's hunger for the original. In a culture enamored of gleaming appliances and clean angles, value tends to attach itself to novelty, finish, and ownership. Her work withholds those satisfactions. It refuses the capitalist fantasy that the world can be made new by disposing of what is damaged, dated, or inconvenient. Against this, it proposes an alternative modernity, one not founded on oblivion, but on a difficult hospitality toward remnants. Progress, in this vision, is not the brisk replacement of old forms by new ones, but the capacity to live with what cannot be fully recovered and should not be denied. There is, however, a productive irritation in this aesthetic. Critics who dismiss such passages as dull digressions on art or Booker tricks are not simply inattentive readers. Their impatience exposes a recurring suspicion in Australian cultural life, that art which announces its debts to European high culture risks pretension, evasion, or imported seriousness. The presence of Henry James and the language of the uncanny may seem to some an over-furnished apparatus for local experience. Yet that objection partly proves the point. The novel is interested precisely in the discomfort produced when Australian reality cannot be contained by plain speech, realism, or anti-intellectual modesty. Its absences require indirection. Its ghosts do not arrive on cue, but through copies, quotations, traces, and damaged likenesses. The Lost Dog presents Australian identity not as a settled inheritance, but as a nervous arrangement, modern, ironic, hygienic, and perpetually threatened by what it has tried to exclude. Its Australia values efficiency, cosmopolitan polish, and the clean surfaces of the new, yet remains disturbed by older, less manageable presences, colonial violence, migrant memory, bodily decay, environmental depth, and the stubborn fact that no home is ever made from emptiness. The nation's preferred fantasy is disposal. The novel's counter-argument is return. Tom Loxley's predicament makes this cultural unease intimate. His shame before the archaic, the maternal, and the foreign is not merely personal embarrassment. It is a small-scale drama of a national habit. Australia's flight into modernity depends upon treating certain histories and bodies as waste, Indigenous presence recast as absence, migrants as foreign matter, the aging as inconvenient reminders of animal vulnerability. Yet what is discarded does not disappear. It comes back as Gothic pressure, as art made from salvage, as the dog's wounded return, as the mother's body refusing the discipline of polite concealment. The things Australians create, then, reveal a culture skilled at irony, but less secure in belonging than its surfaces suggest. Its art is drawn to absence because absence is one of the country's founding materials. Its modernity is haunted because its sense of home has been built through acts of forgetting that cannot quite be completed. De Kretser's achievement is to resist the sentimental consolation that ghosts can simply be laid to rest. Reconciliation in this vision is not purification but accommodation, the difficult making of room for what unsettles the house. Australian identity emerges as a condition of becoming rather than being, an unfinished negotiation with otherness, memory, and place. The sanctuary remains uncanny because home is not secured by exclusion. It begins more awkwardly and more honestly when the knocking is heard. That's all for this episode of Essays from a Strange Country. I'm Jasmine Wolfe, and you've been listening to a small attempt to make sense of Australian identity through the things we create when we're not busy avoiding the question entirely. Film, literature, art and music give us more than cultural decoration. They give us evidence. If today's episode has left you with a firmer answer about what Australia is, I'm afraid something has gone wrong. The point is not to solve the country, the point is to notice how often it contradicts itself and how revealing those contradictions can be. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, share it, or mention it vaguely to someone at a barbecue before the conversation collapses into real estate. Until next time, keep reading the margins, watching the background, and listening for what the culture tries not to say.